The morning sun filtered gently through the linen curtains, casting golden stripes across the polished wooden floor of the Davis home. It was the kind of morning that novels romanticize and memory preserves, soft, slow, and deceptively peaceful. The faint hum of the coffee machine in the kitchen sang a lullaby to the waking house. And the clinking sound of a spoon against ceramic blended seamlessly with the rustling of pages from a newspaper. It was a symphony of domestic tranquility. Martin Davis, 35, sat at the head of the dining table, barefoot, dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and work pants still creased from yesterday. His fingers were calloused from years of construction work, but they handled the newspaper delicately, as if searching for something more meaningful than headlines, perhaps a reassurance that the world outside matched the peace he felt inside his home. His face bore the kind of lines that don't come from age, but from responsibility, the kind of quiet burden that turns a man into a protector, a provider, a constant. Yet, behind his mild blue eyes, there was always a spark of gentle wonder, a romantic streak Olivia often teased him about. He had built bridges and stadiums, poured concrete across highways, but nothing felt more permanent, more real, than the breakfast table before him. Across the room, Olivia moved gracefully between the fridge and the stove, humming faintly to herself as she flipped pancakes for their 6-year-old son. Dylan. She was 33, with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could soften any tension, calm any storm. She moved with the ease of someone who had found her rhythm in motherhood. And to any stranger, the sight would have been cinematic, something straight from a home insurance commercial. But perfection is often the most beautiful disguise. Martin adored Olivia, always had, from the first moment they met at a friend's backyard barbecue, a warm evening tinged with grilled smoke and the scent of cheap beer. She had captivated him. Not because she was the loudest or the most striking, but because she radiated a kind of quiet control. He was drawn to her steadiness, the way she spoke with intention, how she laughed with her whole body. She made him feel safe in a world that rarely offered men like him softness. They married within a year, too fast, some said, but to Martin, it had felt inevitable. Olivia, a former literature major who once dreamed of publishing poetry, had given up her ambitions for stability, or so he believed. She slipped into domestic life like she had been preparing for it her entire life. And when Dylan arrived, everything snapped into place. The tidy house, the family photos, even the golden retriever their son named Comet. But even in the most tranquil waters, some currents run deep. There had been a moment, shortly after Dylan's birth, when Martin had asked, casually, if they should get a DNA test done, not because he suspected anything, but because of an article he read about rare blood incompatibilities and how early knowledge could save lives. Olivia had laughed, not nervously, not with hesitation, but with a softness that made Martin feel foolish. She brushed a hand through his hair and said, "You're always thinking like an engineer, solving problems before they happen." The next day, she handed him a document, an official-looking lab report, blood type confirmation, paternity 99.9% assured. He hadn't pushed further. He wasn't that kind of man. Suspicion wasn't in his nature, and trust had always been his default. But Evelyn never fully did. Evelyn Davis, Martin's mother, was a woman sculpted by precision. A retired biology teacher, she had spent decades teaching high school students to trust data, not feelings. She was polite but distant with Olivia, not cold, but cautious, as if her instincts, honed by a lifetime of empirical thinking, couldn't be lulled by a charming daughter-in-law or the warmth of a baby's giggle. She loved her grandson deeply, but she stared at him too long when he laughed, as if cataloging every deviation. She never said anything, not even when Dylan's eyes turned out hazel while both Martin and Olivia claimed blue-eyed parents. Not when he began to show a dimple on the left cheek, an exact replica of Daniel, Olivia's college boyfriend, whose photo once sat, oddly framed, in her childhood bedroom. Martin had noticed it the first time he visited her parents' home. But after their engagement, it mysteriously disappeared. He never asked. Perhaps he didn't want the answer. He didn't have a reason to. Olivia loved him. Dylan adored him. Their life was enviable, quiet, structured, full of soft rituals and reliable joys. Pancakes on Sunday, walks with Comet in the park, afternoon games of catch that ended in laughter. But real things cast shadows. And some shadows are made not by the absence of light, but by the truth someone works tirelessly to obscure. That morning, Martin leaned forward to kiss Olivia's cheek as she set the pancakes down. She smiled, the same smile that had anchored him through layoffs and long weeks. Dylan ran into the room, barefoot and laughing, leaping into Martin's lap with syrup-covered fingers. Martin wrapped his arms around the boy, feeling the familiar weight of fatherhood. He laughed, ruffling Dylan's soft hair, not knowing that beneath that grin, so full of life and trust, a storm had already begun to form. A storm seeded not in malice, but in a moment of fear 6 years ago. A moment Olivia thought she had buried beneath a document and a warm smile. But truth has a pulse. And it was starting to beat louder. It began with bruises that shouldn't have lingered. Dylan came home from school one afternoon with a scrape on his knee and a faint purplish patch on his arm that hadn't been there that morning. Olivia brushed it off. He'd fallen. Maybe bumped into something. But over the next few weeks, the bruises multiplied. Some appeared without cause. Others darkened too quickly, spread too far. Martin started to notice how winded Dylan became after light running. How pale his skin turned under the sun and how he'd often come home too tired to finish dinner. There was something beneath the surface. Something that refused to be ignored. Then came the fevers. Short, violent bursts of heat that left Dylan shivering in sweat-soaked sheets in the middle of the night. Olivia would sit beside him, wiping his forehead, singing lullabies half-remembered from her childhood, while Martin paced outside the room, fingers clenched and jaw-locked. For a man who solved structural equations for a living, who measured stress loads and reinforced beams, this was unbearable. Here was a problem he could not fix. One night, Dylan collapsed in the schoolyard. The call came from the principal, and Martin's world narrowed to a tunnel of flashing sirens and sterile hospital corridors. They moved fast, blood tests, spinal taps, long words with Greek roots and Latin endings. Words like pancytopenia and marrow failure. When the hematologist finally sat him down, the air in the room felt heavier than lead. "Your son has aplastic anemia," she said. "His bone marrow isn't producing the blood cells he needs. He'll require transfusions, but long-term, he needs a bone marrow transplant, preferably from a relative." Martin didn't hesitate. "Test me. I'll donate whatever he needs." He said it with the certainty of a father who never doubted his role. Who had read bedtime stories, fixed scraped knees, built backyard treehouses. But biology has no regard for stories. The results came back the next morning. "Your blood types don't match. Not even close." Martin blinked. "That can't be right. I'm O positive." The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Dylan is AB." There was a pause that stretched so long it carved itself into Martin's spine like a knife. It wasn't just incompatible, it was impossible. He stumbled back into the hallway, past the nurses and the vending machine and the antiseptic smell of false hope. He didn't know why, but his feet took him to a bench near the chapel. He sat, phone in hand, and called his mother. "Something's wrong," he said, voice hoarse. Evelyn didn't gasp or offer reassurances. She listened. Then she asked a simple question. "Do you want the truth, Martin, or do you want comfort?" "The truth," he whispered. "Then I'll get it for you." 3 days passed in quiet agony. Olivia stayed by Dylan's side, exhausted but devoted, reading books in soft voices, adjusting his blankets. Martin watched her, watched the woman he loved become someone unrecognizable. Her eyes darted more. She jumped when he entered the room. She didn't ask him how he was holding up. Then Evelyn handed him a manila envelope. Her face unreadable. Inside, 2 stapled lab reports. DNA analysis. 1 strand from Martin, 1 from Dylan. Paternity probability, 0%. His heart didn't shatter, It disintegrated. Martin walked into the hospital room with the envelope in his hand. Olivia looked up from Dylan, eyes bloodshot and tired. "You lied to me," he said. She didn't move. "Tell me who he is." She closed her eyes, took a breath that looked like it hurt. "Daniel, a name from the past. A ghost with a face." Daniel, Olivia's college sweetheart. Martin had seen a photo once. In a drawer she thought he wouldn't open. A man with deep-set eyes and that same lopsided dimple Dylan had. He died in a car crash 6 years ago. A closed casket funeral. Martin had driven Olivia to the service. She hadn't cried until they got home. Back then, he thought it was grief for a friend. Now he knew better. It was one night. Olivia said, "You were on a site inspection in Denver. He was in town. We met for coffee. It just happened. I thought it was over. But then he died, and I realized I was pregnant a week later." Martin sat down, not because he was weak, but because the weight of betrayal was too much to carry standing up. "I couldn't tell you," Olivia said. "I didn't even tell Daniel. He died before I had the chance. And you were so excited. I couldn't take that from you." Martin looked at the sleeping boy. Dylan's face was peaceful, oblivious, but Martin saw the truth now, etched into the lines of that little face. In the curve of his smile. In the way he laughed with abandon. Like someone who had never had to lie. "You took that from me anyway," Martin said. Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Outside, machines beeped. Nurses called names. Life continued. But inside the room, everything had stopped. He could still feel Dylan's arms around his neck. Still hear the boy's voice yelling, "Daddy, watch this," from atop the jungle gym. Still remember the first time Dylan fell asleep on his chest. A tiny heartbeat fluttering like a bird against his ribs. The test said he wasn't the father. But his heart refused to believe it. And now he was left with a truth that had no shape, only pain. He didn't know what to do with it. Not yet. But one thing was certain. The body never lies. And once you know the truth, it demands something of you. A reckoning. The days following the revelation were a blur of clinical updates, exhausted silences, and unspoken conversations stretched tight across every room. Martin couldn't sleep in the hospital recliner anymore. Not next to her, not after the truth had hollowed out their shared world. He moved into a guest lounge. The kind meant for out-of-town relatives and broken hearts. Evelyn brought him fresh clothes and sat with him in heavy silence, only speaking when words were necessary. On the third day, she placed a hand on his knee. "You have to think about next steps," she said, "not just for him, but for you." Martin nodded. His voice was hoarse. "I want a divorce." Evelyn didn't blink. She had been waiting for it. Not hoping, but knowing. She had seen too many students in her classroom with eyes full of confusion and parents who smiled too wide. She knew what deception looked like in the aftermath. But Olivia wasn't finished. That evening, she waited for Martin outside Dylan's room, her face blotchy with dried tears and exhaustion. "Please," she said before he could pass. "I know what I did was unforgivable. But you have to believe me. Daniel never knew. He never got to know. I kept it from everyone. Even myself. For a long time." Martin didn't answer. He just looked at her. Really looked. This was the woman he had built his life around. And now all he could see were the cracks she had hidden so well. The next morning, a manila envelope was delivered to the hospital addressed to Martin. Inside was a formal letter from a law firm and a notarized document. A last will and testament. From Daniel Whitaker. Martin sat down slowly, hands trembling as he unfolded the pages. The language was formal but direct. "In the event of my death, should it be revealed that I have a child, I request legal guardianship be offered to Martin Davis. I owe Martin my life. 10 years ago, he pulled me from a burning car on the I-405. We never spoke after that day, but I never forgot it. If I cannot raise my child, I want him to." Martin stared at the page until the words blurred. His lungs refused air. He remembered the night clearly now. A car flipped. Smoke. Flames. He had been driving home late from a project site. Saw the wreck. Pulled over, sprinted into fire. He hadn't known the man's name then. Daniel had been unconscious, slumped behind the wheel. The paramedics arrived. Martin had disappeared before anyone could take his name. He hadn't needed thanks. And yet here it was, a message from the grave. The coincidence was staggering. The universe, it seemed, was folding in on itself. He read the letter again, not as a legal document, but as a confession, as a benediction, as a curse. If I have a child, let him be raised by Martin. Martin folded the letter with deliberate care. The lines between betrayal and fate blurred. Dylan, asleep in a room down the hall, carried the blood of a man Martin had saved. A man Olivia had once loved. A man who had unknowingly tethered them all together. He stood, eyes stinging. Olivia found him hours later. In the hospital chapel. You saved him, she whispered, and now you're saving his son. Martin didn't answer. He couldn't yet define what this meant. Love, responsibility, guilt, or something older, deeper. A reckoning owed to the past. All he knew was this. Everything he believed about his family had changed. But Dylan hadn't, and maybe, just maybe, that was where something real could begin again. Or end completely. Martin stood in the sterile hallway. The faint scent of disinfectant lingering like memory. The divorce papers were folded in his coat pocket, unsigned. Every time his fingers brushed the envelope, they recoiled like they had touched fire. He had played the scenario 1,000 times in his mind, packing his bags. Walking away, leaving behind a woman who had betrayed him and a child who wasn't his. Only it wasn't that simple anymore. Dylan lay in a hospital bed down the hall, small and pale beneath blankets that seemed too heavy for his 6-year-old frame. Machines beeped and sighed beside him, mapping his fragile pulse. Martin sat in the corner of the room most nights now, watching his son, no, Daniel's son, sleep. But the distinction felt increasingly abstract. Because in every breath, in every small smile Dylan gave when half awake, Martin saw something deeper than blood. He saw history. He saw a life shared. He saw himself. But Olivia's voice still echoed in his mind, raw from their last argument. I never meant to destroy us, she had said, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. You were gone. I was lost. And when I realized, when I knew it was Daniel's baby, I thought I could bury it. I thought if I loved you enough, it wouldn't matter. You didn't give me the choice, Martin had said. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut like steel. You lied from the beginning. Then let me go, she had whispered. If you can't forgive me, I won't fight you. Just don't punish him for my mistake. Later that night, Martin returned to Dylan's room. He didn't realize the boy was awake. Dylan looked at him, eyes wide and quiet. Dad, he said, using the word like a question. Am I not yours? Martin froze. The air was suddenly thicker. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. His son. You heard something, Martin said slowly. Dylan nodded. You and Mom were fighting. You said, I was Daniel's. Martin didn't speak for a long time. Outside, the night nurse passed by, humming softly. He turned back to Dylan, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. What matters, Martin said, is that you're mine now. And I'm not going anywhere. Dylan blinked, as if trying to process something too big for his years. Then he nodded and turned his face into the pillow, silent but calm. After Dylan drifted to sleep, Martin stayed by the bedside, staring at the boy's features, the dimple on his left cheek, the way his hands curled in sleep. He remembered Daniel's photo, the one in Olivia's drawer. The resemblance was undeniable, even in the smallest things, the way Dylan held a spoon, or how he crossed one leg over the other when reading. The next morning, Olivia met him outside the room, holding a pen and the divorce papers. Her hands trembled as she offered them. If this is what you need to heal, I won't stop you, she said. I just asked to see him, to be his mother. Martin took the papers, looked at them, then looked at her. You don't get to make this simple, he said, but it doesn't have to be cruel either. He tore the papers in half. Olivia gasped. You're staying? He shook his head. I'm not staying for you. Martin said. "I'm staying for him, for Daniel, for what he asked of me. And because Dylan doesn't deserve to be punished for a truth he never chose." She said nothing. There was no victory in her eyes. Only relief twisted with guilt. Martin walked back into the hospital room and sat down by Dylan again. This time not as a man uncertain of his place, but as a father who had made a decision. Blood could define biology, but love, sacrifice, and memory would define something else entirely. Family. The house was smaller, quieter, the kind of place where cicadas hummed in the evenings and neighbors nodded from porches instead of waving from behind steering wheels. Martin chose it for that reason. The noise of the city had always been background, until it became unbearable. Here, on the edge of a sleepy town framed by fields and trees older than memory, he could breathe again, and more importantly, so could Dylan. The boy had recovered slowly. Transfusions, medications, checkups every month, but the light had returned to his eyes, the color to his cheeks. He'd grown an inch that year. His hair was longer, his laughter was louder, and Martin, somehow, was still standing. They had built a new life. Quiet routines, morning oatmeal with too much cinnamon, evening walks with flashlights pointed at frogs and tree roots. Dylan had a hammock now, where he read books upside down and asked too many questions about the stars. Martin had learned to answer what he could, and admit what he couldn't. But one question lingered in the air between them, never spoken directly again, the question of whose blood Dylan carried. Martin never lied, but he didn't confirm, and in that silence, something softer grew between them. Each year, on Dylan's birthday, Martin made a chocolate cake from scratch. It was never perfect, too dry one year, too sweet the next, but Dylan loved them. After they sang and unwrapped gifts, Martin would set 2 candles on the cake, one for Dylan, and one more, unlabeled. The boy never asked, he just watched his father light both, eyes reflecting something solemn for a child so young. Martin never explained the second candle, but he placed it with a reverence that Dylan seemed to understand. At night, Martin told him stories, not fairy tales, but real ones, of bravery, of moments when someone stepped up even when they were afraid. He taught Dylan CPR, how to splint a broken arm, how to listen when someone's voice cracked with unshed tears. Lessons wrapped in bedtime rituals. He called it the quiet code. Dylan once asked, "Why do we have to learn all this stuff, Dad?" Martin had smiled. "Because one day, you might be the reason someone else survives." There was a photograph on Martin's desk, framed in wood. On the left, Dylan, arms crossed, grinning with a missing front tooth. On the right, Daniel, a photo Martin had tracked down through Olivia, the man whose death had started it all, the man whose life Martin had once saved without knowing who he was. They shared a shelf, they always would. One autumn afternoon, Dylan sat beside him on the porch swing, legs too short to touch the ground. "Dad," he said, licking chocolate frosting off his thumb, "why don't you marry someone? All the other kids at school have 2 parents." Martin looked out across the rust-colored trees, their leaves turning to fire. "Because," he said, "I already live with the 2 people I love the most. You. And the person you remind me of." Dylan tilted his head. "Like a ghost." Martin laughed. "Maybe, but a good ghost, the kind that makes sure we stay good, too." Dylan didn't ask more. He leaned into Martin's side and yawned. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of earth and pine. Martin closed his eyes. He had not forgiven Olivia. Not fully, not yet, maybe never, but he had forgiven himself. For not knowing, for not seeing, for staying, and that, he thought, was enough. He didn't raise Daniel's son out of obligation. He raised him as repayment. A promise, a quiet vow to a man long gone. Not for love, but for honor. And in the end, that was what made him a father.